Hello, I'm Carrie Ann. Welcome to another service with Pastor Ray Dieter at Grace Baptist Church. Please check out our website, gbcevansville.org. There, you'll find videos of our youth and children's services, daily devotions, and other ministries our church has to offer. We invite you to join us on Sunday mornings for an in-person service where we'll practice social distancing and follow safety guidelines. Now, let's hear what Pastor Ray has to say.
Overwhelmingly win. And at a lot of times without losing a single soldier. They just went in and annihilated whoever stood against the nation of God. When they were not in the will of God, they got their rear end spanked hard. And this was one of those times. And so you can look at the battles in the Bible that Israel has won and lost and know the state of Israel just by how the battle went. And so at this point, they were completely out of the will of God. Jehoiakim was not a godly king. But Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came and whooped them bad. And the last part of the second verse you're going to want to take note on, because not next week, but the week after that, this little statement is really going to come into play. Nebuchadnezzar, let's see, where I lost it. I'm sorry, I'm in verse 2. Nebuchadnezzar won. Jehoiakim was handed over to him along with some of the vessels from the house of God. Those are the gold cups and the vessels they used in the temple during sacrifice and worship and things of that nature. These were sacred. Nebuchadnezzar carried these vessels to the land of Babylon, to the house of his, and I'm going to add a word, pagan gods, and put the vessels in the treasury of his gods. Then the king ordered. Now, it wasn't bad enough to take the vessels from the temple, the things that the Israelites used to worship Yahweh, God, our God. No, that wasn't enough. So he commands people to take Israelites from the royal family. And in verse 4, young men without physical defect, good-looking, suitable for instruction in all wisdom, knowledgeable, perceptive, capable of serving in his palace, in Nebuchadnezzar's palace. He was to teach them the Chaldean language, literature, and the king assigned them daily provisions from his food. They were going to get the best Babylon had to offer. I mean, these men were going to be taught, trained, and fed in order to serve the kingdom of Babylon. So, slaves, yes, but really high up on the food chain. You get what I'm saying? So, among these, in verse 6, we got Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. At this time, our biblical scholars believe these guys were somewhere between 14 and 16 years old when they were taken from their home, the only home they'd ever known, and carried off to a foreign country. The gravity of that doesn't sit well with me. Just imagine, you got 14-year-old Nick, he was about yay tall, and about that big around. Little 14-year-old Nick, somebody walks into Kentucky and carries me off to the Congo, we'll say. That's about the most opposite place I can think of from Kentucky. Go from the woods to the jungle. And I'm to serve one of their leaders. That wouldn't have sat well with me. Not at all. I would have been defiant. I would have been, they'd have probably killed me just for the lack of putting up with me. Seriously. Some people threaten to do that even as a Christian. But Daniel, little 14-year-old Daniel, He doesn't do that. He does the exact opposite of what I would do. Daniel, he was a good boy. He learned what he was supposed to learn. He excelled at learning what he was supposed to learn. He did everything that he thought his God would have him to do. Until one point where it come down to the king's food. So this was a trial that Daniel was going through. Daniel had been taken from his home, brought into a foreign country, and placed in the midst of one of the greatest trials that most of us now could possibly conceive. He was taken away from his parents. The Bible doesn't say that Daniel's parents went with them. Young men were taken. Now, I don't know about you all, but when I was 14, my dad was not considered a young man. He wouldn't have been in that group. The Bible doesn't say that they took their parents. So Daniel and these other three, they were taken away from their families and their home. They were all alone. They just had each other. We don't know if they knew each other at that time or not, but I guarantee you they got friendly. But they left everything they knew in Jerusalem and are now in a completely different place. At first, they didn't understand the language. They had never seen food like this before. They'd never seen art in the palace like that before. They had never seen any of this. Babylon is a long way. Israel is it's a coastal country. They eat a lot of that type of food that coastal countries eat. Babylon was very pork heavy. So Daniel knows the scriptures. He's been trained. And he knows what he's supposed to do and what he's not supposed to do. But before I get too far into this, we need to take a minute and realize that Christians eventually are going to go through a trial. All of us will. Doesn't matter when we got saved. Doesn't matter how old we were when we got saved. Doesn't matter where we were. We're going to go through a trial phase in our Christian life. All of us do. When I wrote that, one pastor friend of mine popped into my head. He was one of the smartest guys I'd ever met. He's a little older than me. When I was in middle school, he graduated high school. And he surrendered to the ministry under my Uncle Randy. A lot of you guys know him. He's preached revivals here. He surrendered to ministry under Uncle Randy when Uncle Randy was at Berea in Kentucky. And this guy goes to Clear Creek Bible College, graduates in 3 years with a double, and he had a double major, one from Clear Creek and one from Lincoln Memorial University that was about 15 miles down the road, in 3 years. He goes to seminary, gets a PhD. He has his PhD by the age of 28. His first church was small. They ran about 60, 70 people. He goes from there to a 300-member church, a 300 attendance. He goes from there to a 600 to 800. He goes from there up into a 15 to 2,000 people church. And it just continues. It's just, everything is in his stead. Everything is going for him. There's nothing this guy can do wrong. He's a powerhouse. He's coming up. Guys like Charles Stanley are asking who this guy is, wanting to meet him. Guys like James Merritt are wanting to meet this guy. You know, he's starting to rub elbows with the people that I see as the heroes in today's faith, are powerhouse pastors. I mean, he is on his way up. This young man from South Central Kentucky that no one knew. Just God has just skyrocketed him. There was no problems. Then all of a sudden, his son has cancer. Devastating, right? And it's a bad cancer. It gets in his bones. Someone in the church said, "Adam, I'll give you the use of my jet. You can fly." He was in Alabama. Said, "You can fly to the Children's Hospital in Memphis for all the treatments." That's helpful, but he's still got cancer. They didn't know if he was going to make it. I don't know what that's like. So, they go through this trial phase. They pray through it. They do everything. Everything is just looking like it's going into the pits. And then all of a sudden, little feller's cancer-free. God took care of it. He didn't lose a limb. But can you imagine, the parents in the room, can you imagine this little 7, 8-year-old boy going through cancer, watching your 7, 8-year-old son going through it? Some of you may have. That's the trial that pops into my head. The second one is a guy I worked with. Surrendered to the ministry. Come out of the KKK, actually. He was an active member of the KKK. And he is not a guy you want to run into. Tattooed, 6'8", 400 pound, red-headed, shaved down. I mean, he's a mean-looking dude. He was a mechanic with me when I worked for Chrysler. And he surrendered to the ministry. His dad was a Methodist pastor. He surrendered to be a Methodist pastor. His son gets cancer. His son lost his leg to cancer. His son was 8. So they went through that trial. They prayed through it. They let God lead them through it. Whatever happened, happened. God had it. Both of these men would tell you that. The whole way through it, we didn't know what was going to happen. But whatever happened, God had it. God guided it. Now, Ryan's son is doing great. At that age, you can really get good on a prosthetic. Okay? I mean, he took to it. He got him a little Ninja Turtles prosthetic. He's going for it. You know, the little fella runs like everybody else. But James chapter 1, verse 2, and I'll read it real quick. It says, "Consider it a great joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you experience various trials." When you read that, you think about the trials that you've dealt with in your life. Consider that joy? Think back to some of the worst times in your life as a Christian. Or consider that joy. How in the world? Well, the Bible says it. We're supposed to do that. Wonder why? Well, let's read the rest of it there. Verse 3. "Because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its full effect, so that you may be mature and complete, lacking nothing." God has it. God's got a purpose for it. He's using those trials to mature us as Christians, to make us a better witness, a better Christian, a better person. It's all got a plan. It's all a purpose. Every bit of it. Daniel knew that. There was a purpose. There was a plan. But Daniel also had a limit. And this is where we see how we as Christians handle trials. It sets us apart from the other people around us. How we handle these trials is when the lost people see it and say, "How are you doing that?" That's when the people at work look at you and say, "How are you still alive?" I watched some of the mechanics that worked with me and Ryan look at him and say, "Ryan, how can you be a preacher when God is doing this to your son?" But it's how we handle trials what sets us apart. Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael and Azariah were still followers of God, no matter where they were. They were in Babylon, does not matter. They're still followers of God. They did not bow down to the pagan gods. When it come down to, in verse 8, with Daniel being offered the king's food, it was not food that at that time, the Old Testament law did not permit them to eat that. That was against God's law. And if you want to look that up, it's Leviticus 11, I'm sorry. But it was against the law for them to eat that food. And so Daniel comes up with an idea. And I'm sure it's God-inspired. All good ideas really are. So we come down to it. He says, "Hey, give me vegetables and water." And I don't know if this is right or not, but some of the scholars think it's like a vegetable poultice or like a mash of some sort. I think of oatmeal when I think of it, but made out of vegetables. I don't know if that's true or not, but it helps you get a mental picture. So imagine something like that in a bowl, and they're served that for every meal with water. And their boss was like, "Nah, man, I can't do that." It's like, when you guys start looking puny and sickly, King's going to kill me. There's no second chances with this guy. He's going to kill me. Like, I can't do that. He said, "Look, trust it. Test us. Give us a time of testing. Give us this food and see how we look at the end." Now, do you think that Daniel, when he was in Judah, living in the royal palace, do you think that he got a college education on the finer skills of culinary science? Because I don't think he did. Do you think he got a dietitian's education somewhere along the way? That he just knew this was going to be okay? Because I don't think that was the point. I think the point is, David knew that if he kept to God's law, God would take care of it. End of story. So, Daniel just trusted that God was handling it. And God obviously did. At the end of this testing period, Daniel and his boys were the most healthy, the most fit, and the best looking of all of them that they took. All these other guys ate the king's food. They did not look as healthy as Daniel. So guess what happens? The boss gives everybody Daniel's little mixture. There was some mad boys at the table that night. They're used to eating pork and having all this good stuff to eat, and all of a sudden now they ain't eating nothing but a vegan diet. That would make me upset. But anyway, God took care of Daniel. That's the point of it. So, the questions we need to ask ourselves is, what was Daniel's motivation for this? Was it just because he knew it was against God's law? Was it just because he was scared that if he broke God's law, God would kill him? What was Daniel's motivation? Daniel's motivation was Daniel's love for God. We will see that as this series progresses, this 4-sermon series on faith. We're going to see that Daniel's love for God was the reason this started back when he was so young. But Daniel didn't do it out of fear that God would punish him. Daniel didn't do it out of, just because I'm supposed to, just because that's the way Mommy and Daddy taught me to do. Daniel did it because he loved God. Now let's put that into ours. When I was a teenager, I went to church because Mom and Daddy told me to. My dad's a pastor. Some of you have met him. Dad was the type of guy that when you come to him and say, "Dad, I'm sick, I can't go to church," he said, "Did you throw up?" "Well, no." So, you're faking sick anyway, so you go in the bathroom and make yourself throw up. And I said, "Daddy, I threw up. I'm too sick. I can't go to church." He said, "Well, you threw up?" "Yeah, I threw up." He said, "Well, don't you feel better? Let's go to church." That's the way my dad was. You didn't get out of it. I mean, my brother had a broke leg. Did he get out of going to church? Absolutely not. We had to take 2 cars to church while he had a broke leg, so his big cast would fit in the back seat of one. So, we didn't miss. For nothing or no one. We didn't miss. Now, I went all the way up until, I was moved out and had my own place. But Dad would still call me, "Hey, did you go to church this morning?" And I knew if I lied, he'd know it. So, yeah, I went to church. It never resonated to me until I was married what all that meant. It just didn't get there. My motivation was wrong. I went to church because Dad told me to go to church. That was it. For 25 years, I went to church because Dad told me to go to church. And I knew he'd kick my rump if I didn't. Those are his words. So, when I was 25, I was sitting right about where that coat is in a church in East Tennessee during a revival. I don't remember who was preaching. I don't remember who was doing the music. I can't even see their face in my head anymore. Because basically the whole time I stared at the hymnal in the back pocket. I knew what God was telling me to do, but I'd been fighting it for so long because I didn't want to be a preacher. I just had an inkling in the back of my head that if I got saved, God was going to call me to preach. And I didn't want to do that. Like, it ain't for me. I got a career as a mechanic. I ain't interested in this. So I finally just got up and left. I went out. We had a side door on that side. And I went out and sat in one of the Sunday school classes just to get away from it. I said, I can write it out in Sunday school class. Well, my dadgum brother decides to follow me. And he comes in there, and my brother ends up leading me to Christ. He doesn't necessarily look like somebody that does that, but he knows what's up. So my brother led me to Christ. My motivation changed at that moment. I was no longer going to church because Dad told me to. I was going to church because the God of the church loved me enough to die for me and save me from myself. Because myself was going to get myself put in hell. So your motivation changes at that moment. And from there, it was not a very hard decision about anything else because my motivation was different. Daniel's motivation was a motivation of love for God because he was the God of Israel. He was the God that brought Israel out of Egypt through the Red Sea on dry ground. Some will say that was ankle deep. Some will say it was a marsh. Some will say they went through a shallow spot of the Red Sea. Well, it doesn't really matter how deep it was because one, either they went through real shallow water and God drowned an entire Egyptian army in 2 inches of water, or two, he divided a very deep part of sea. So either way, it's a miracle. But he saved the nation of Israel from slavery, gave them a country, gave them whatever they needed, fed them when they were on the road, made sure their clothes did not wear out while they were on the road. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever wore sandals, but I will tell you sandals will not last 40 years in a desert. But theirs did. God took care of them. Daniel knew all this. He knew the stories. And so Daniel followed God out of the motivation of his love for God. Now, what was Daniel's reward? What was Daniel's reward for following God? Verse 9. God had granted Daniel kindness and compassion from the chief eunuch. Yet he said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king who assigned your food and drink. If he sees your faces looking thinner than other men of your age, you would endanger my life with the king. So Daniel said to the guard, whom the chief eunuch had assigned to Daniel, please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Examine our appearance after that time. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. He agreed to do that for 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, this is verse 15. At the end of 10 days, they looked better and healthier than all the young men who were eating the king's food. Verse 17. God gave these 4 men knowledge and understanding in every kind of literature and wisdom. Daniel also understood visions and dreams of every kind. They stood out. They stood out among all of the other Israelites. Why? They followed God for the right reason. Now, the results of faithfulness. The results of faithfulness are this. When we stick with God, no matter what, no matter who, no matter where, we stick with God for the right reason. Not because, say, God, I'm going to go to church And I'm going to be there every time. I'm going to teach a Sunday school class because I really need you to help me out here. I've got a bill I can't pay. I can't fix my car. And we come and we do stuff for God in order to receive something back. I know we do that because I've been guilty of it. We all do it. Eventually, that's the wrong motivation. If you read deeper in James, he'll tell you, when you ask God for the right reason, God shows up. When you ask God for something, God will supply our needs. But we don't do stuff for God because we want to get stuff back. We do stuff for God because we love God. Why do we love God? Because God saved us. And there ain't no other way to put that. That's it. It's that simple. When we love God because what God did for us, when we serve God out of our love for God, God shows up. And He reminds me of this lesson over and over and over because I am a hard-headed redneck. And I tell you these things, so hopefully you won't be as hard-headed as me. But I learned during Christmas that my nephews are. They're just as hard-headed as the rest of us. There's going to be a fight coming with them boys. But either way, the moral of the story is, why are you at church? Why are we here? Are we here because we're supposed to be? It's Christmas. Are we here because Mama said it's Christmas and you're going to church? That's a common occurrence where I'm from. Are you a Christian because someone in your family told you you should be and you figured you better get it done sooner than later? Why are we following God? I can't answer that for you. If I could, I'd just flat out tell you. Boy, I wished I could do that in the youth group so many times that I could just look at them and say, listen here, this is the way it is. You're going to heaven. I don't care if you like it or not. I'd do it for every one of them. I'd be straight up drill sergeant on them and just say, hey, this is the way it is. This is what you're doing. This is your life now. And there's one youth up there that could vouch for that. I would do that in a heartbeat, but I can't. As bad as I want to, I can't. Each one of us has to decide why we are doing this. The motivation is out of love for God because of what God did for us. And in return, we don't have to spend eternity in hell. Our next installment in this series is entitled The Faith of a Young Adult. The faith of a teenager shows us that even as a 14-year-old, you can stand up to what the King has said. Even as a 14-year-old. And if you need more convincing, read Timothy. There's a couple of them there. Timothy was a teenage preacher in the early church before 90 AD. But I tell my kids all the time, your age doesn't matter. You get saved and you can be just as strong a Christian as any adult. Because obviously we have an Old Testament example. We have New Testament examples in Timothy. And Philemon was young. Titus was young. You can be a strong Christian no matter what age you are. And during this series, we're going to progress through the ages. We're going to have young adults. We're going to have a Christian adult. We're going to have a mature Christian. We're going to have examples of all that. And it's all going to come from Daniel. Because we have the benefit of seeing Daniel from a teenager all the way to a 90-something-year-old adult. And it all happens in 6 chapters. So, if you want to read ahead, read Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's story in Daniel. But I guess I'm pleading with you to understand why you've decided to come to church. And I will tell you that if you have figured out that it's for the wrong reason and that you need it to be the right reason, then it's real simple on how you fix this. You realize that you are a sinner. You admit it. We all sin. We all have. We all are going to continue to even after we get saved, because sin has twisted our nature. But you admit it, first of all. Well, I'm a good person, Pastor Nick. I mean, I haven't killed nobody. I don't steal. I don't do drugs. I pay my bills. Well, yeah, I know a lot of good people. But being a good person is not it. Knowing you're a sinner, for one, no matter how good you are, that is the main part. Knowing you're a sinner. Then secondly, you believe that Christ died for all those sins that you now admit you committed. He died on the cross, and the only reason He allowed Himself to do that was because the wages of sin is death, and none of us can get out of that. So Christ died for it. Christ fulfilled the payment for sin. And then, in doing so, He conquered death, and He came back to life, where He ascended and sits on the right hand of the throne of Jesus now, or on the right hand throne of God. Third, you confess to God. You confess to Him your sins. You ask for forgiveness. Then you ask Jesus to come into your heart as your Savior. And in doing so, you are committing for the rest of your life to follow God. No matter what, no matter when, no matter who. It's a lifelong commitment. And that's it. And my dad adds a D. Do it now. A, B, C, D. Admit, believe, confess, do it now. And he adds do it now because none of us know how much longer we have on the earth. No matter our age, no matter our health status. If nothing else, COVID has taught us we don't know how long we have left on the earth. If that was the only purpose for COVID, it has definitely served its purpose. So, I'm going to end with that. Robert's going to come sing a hymn of invitation. All right, we're going to have deacons down here to talk to anybody. I'm going to be down here. I'm willing to talk with anybody. If you've realized that your motivation is flawed and that you need to correct it, please, please do not leave here without doing so. Because unfortunately, we may not see each other again. We don't know when Jesus is coming back, and we don't know when we're going to meet Him. So I beg you to come forward and get it handled before there's not a chance to handle it.
Thanks again for joining us for another service with Grace Baptist Church. Connect with us using the social media links on our website, gbcevansville.org. We look forward to seeing you again next week.